Hello, welcome back to our summer 2021 series on developing a tier one system and practices. Today, our focus is universal screening process. And for those of you who are returning, you know we've already spent a considerable amount of time discussing many of the stages of a tier one system and practices. And after today, we've only got one more session that we'll be recording and broadcasting next week. So stay tuned for our final week, but our focus today is universal screening process. We always start each session from a preventative lens, and today the preventative lens is identical. So why would a school, why would a district use a universal screening process? So from the prevention perspective, they allow us to identify students with internalizing behaviors. They also provide individual and aggregate data points to gauge student readiness for learning, which is really critical. And finally, but of equal importance, they allow data collection for resource allocation and planning, both school-wide and district-wide. So now I am going to hand off to my expert colleague, Molly White, to go into the depths of universal screening. Molly, thank you for presenting today.
Thanks, Lisa. So what is universal screening? Universal screening is a process, or it can be an individual tool or a prepackaged item you can purchase. But what these things do is systematically scan your entire school population, and it looks to identify students who may require additional social, emotional, or behavioral health supports. This universal screening process or tool relies on common and observable behaviors as indicators of social, emotional strength and risk. So when we talk about universal screening, you'll see on the next slide, there are common myths and misconceptions. I said it is reliant on those common observable behaviors because what it is not is a psychological assessment, a formal diagnosis, or a progress monitoring tool. All of those things typically happen, like psychological assessment or a formal diagnosis would not occur in a school at this tier one level. And a progress monitoring tool is something completely different that we would want individualized based on the student. And then universal screening itself, it will not and does not interpret the behavior in any way. Like I said, it just documents those observable behaviors, and it does not require any specialized knowledge or advanced training to administer or record student information. It's commonly done by the classroom teacher because they spend the most time in a day with a student. And that can look a little different in a high school setting. Obviously, there's multiple teachers that have multiple touch points with their students throughout the day. So when we're thinking about a school implementing a universal screener, there's some readiness that you want to have in place ahead of implementing this screener. You would want to ensure that both your tier one and your advanced tier or your tier 2-3 team are functioning at full capacity, meaning that you already have a well-established referral or request for assistance procedures, which you'll see in next week's video, having an adequate and comprehensive array of evidence-based interventions, having these already installed and in place within your tier 1 and your tier 2-3 systems, so that you, as your screening students, you have the supports already available for them. And you would also want decision rules. When you're screening, whether it is with a prepackaged universal screening tool or with a universal screening process that you've developed with your school-based teams, you want to make sure that there are rules in place for how students enter into interventions and then subsequently exit out of those interventions once they've met certain goals. And then finally, you want to make sure that you're regularly reviewing fidelity data, screening data, and outcome data at the appropriate tiered teams. And this supports those database decision making, like having students enter and exit, but also quality improvement. That'll help you look at students that have been receiving interventions for a certain amount of time, whether or not they're meeting their goals. Is this a result of, lack of fidelity, or is it just not aligned with the student's needs? So once you have all of those in place, there are some screening process indicators we would want you to think about, which can help you provide some sort of information about social emotional functioning. So if you were not looking to purchase a universal screening tool or to implement a tool, some of them are free, but you would rather have kind of a process that you establish within your school district, these are some indicators that could be a proxy for student social emotional health and well-being. So you could look at office discipline referrals, or incidents of problem behaviors. You could look at chronic absenteeism and academic functioning. And when you look at all three of these together, it can be a predictor of student success. So that was a little bit about the universal screening process. But if you're more interested in purchasing or implementing a tool or a universal screening tool, our partners at the Behavioral Health Improvement Institute at Keene State College have completed a review of some common screening tools. And each of these that you see on the left-hand side, it starts with the BASC-3 and goes all the way down to the SRSSIE. Each of these are teacher completed, which means that the teacher would take time and fill it out for each individual student. And across the top, you'll see some items that they reviewed, whether or not it's appropriate for K-12. Does it build general well-being and skills, or does it look at general well-being and skills? Does it identify or look at internalizing and externalizing behaviors? Is it low to no cost? Does it take less than 5 minutes per student? And that's key with these ones because, like I said previously, the teacher is filling them out for each individual student. This is not student reported. So you wouldn't want them to be taking too much time, because teachers can have 15 to 20, 25 students that they're filling these out for. Is it teacher rated? And then, of course, we're always looking to see if they're evidence-based as well. And with that, I will pass it over to my colleague, Catherine.
Thanks so much, Molly. So Molly did a really wonderful job explaining a little bit of the distinction between a universal screening process, using that set of criteria regularly at a couple points throughout the school year versus using a teacher rated tool. And we just wanted to offer a few other considerations when selecting a tool if you chose to go the route of purchasing or using one of the free to low cost tools. So the first column here being, is it comprehensive and does it fit within your MTSSB framework? So again, thinking about the reach of it, is it appropriate for K through 12, or is it only specific to a few select group of students? And again, going through a few of those things that Molly mentioned about the measuring indicators of well-being and those internalizing and externalizing behaviors. And just as a side note there, one of the huge benefits of using a screening process or tool is that it helps to, or really a tool in particular, it helps to identify students who have some of those internalizing behaviors that may not be connected with the services they need, because they tend to be quiet, they're more introverted, and they may not be causing the quote unquote problems that some other behaviors might be in the classroom, and sometimes they can be overlooked even if they are struggling. Also considering the feasibility around the cost and the length, and then of course always the fact that it must be teacher rated in New Hampshire, because we do have RSA 186, which doesn't allow for student rated non-academic surveys to be administered. So you want to make sure it's something that the teacher is doing. And last but not least, is it evidence-based? So are there these indicators internally reliable, the validity, sensitivity, and specificity of the screening tool that you are looking at? And those are 3 or 4 benchmarks that you can use when you're really looking at those tools. One thing that is important to note and that the research shows is that because the screening process is not a self-identified process by the student themselves, and it's being done by an external person, there is quite an opportunity for bias to occur in the screening process. And those of us who've been in education for some time know that this happens all the time on an individual student level. Thinking about the reputation of a particular student, or if they have a younger sibling coming up, thinking, oh, this particular family has caused problems. And so if there's a rating for this student, there's the opportunity for the teachers to over-identify or under-identify specific students. But research also shows that groups of students tend to be over-identified. And this is particularly true for Black and Latinx students who are found to be over-identified using a universal screening process. And so thinking about that as you're selecting a tool, it's worth noting that the SABRS screener has been seen to have some of the least amount of bias when it's been used and researched in the past. And so that's something to consider. Additionally, if you're not using a tool, it's been noted that using only office discipline referrals as the screening process or as the proxy for student social emotional health over identifies 3 times more than a screening process for Black students. And so really considering this as you're implementing the tool and making sure that your staff have the proper training to, as objectively as possible, rate students internalizing and externalizing behaviors. So offering implicit bias trainings around using a universal screening process, and also diversity and cultural competence training to gain the knowledge, skills, and resources for connecting students with those services once they've been identified. Next, we wanted to go into a little bit about what a timeline would look like for doing the universal social emotional screening process. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but we really do like the sort of phased approach, and beginning to think about the screening process even before the school year has begun is really critical, because you want to be able to capture where students are at generally by October. That's what the research indicates is really the time that's important. They call it sometimes the October catch when you're thinking about other academic indicators or behavior indicators, because anything before October, you may not have the data or the understanding of students that you need, and anything later than October starts to become difficult to really address the need and connect students to the supports that they require. So considering all of that when you're planning for your social emotional screening. And lastly, we wanted to have you think a little bit about how you use the data. With any intervention, one of the biggest indicators for success is how often the evaluation data the data is reflected back to those who are implementing the practice. So if you collect all of this data on how students are faring, but you don't do anything with it, it becomes a sort of a menial, useless task, and we don't want people engaging in futile tasks. So here are some considerations. Most importantly is who will have access to the student level screening data. You do want to make sure you're being FERPA compliant. And this, while again, as Molly so beautifully explained, this has nothing to do with psychological testing and is really observable behavior. So it really doesn't fall into anything clinical, you do want to be considerate and think about who has access to this data. Who will analyze the data to match students to interventions? Again, that speaks back to having those advanced tier teams in place prior to beginning the screening process. How will the data be analyzed by subgroups? And that also speaks to the avoiding bias in the screening process. If you notice certain trends, what is this telling you about your process? Is there room for improvement to make sure that students aren't being over-identified or under-identified? How will this data, aggregate data, never individual student data, be shared with stakeholders, and where would it be appropriate to do so? And again, help make positive change for students. And lastly, how will families become aware of this student level data that's really impacting their student and their well-being and their readiness to learn at school? If you have questions, which we imagine you might, as you embark on the journey of a universal screening process in your school, we really hope you will reach out to us. If you see that your region is not currently does not currently have a consultant, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Molly. We're here to help you no matter where you are in the state. And last but not least, as Lisa mentioned, our final session in the summer series about Tier 1 systems will be around developing a single request for assistance in schools. And so we will hope you will join us for that next week. Thanks so much.